This campaign here, the Gallipoli Campaign, was really, really pivotal. Now, for those who don't know, World War One was made up of obviously the Entente powers, which was Britain, France, and Russia, and the Central powers, which was made up of obviously everyone knows Germany and Austria, but not so many people know about the Ottomans and the Middle Eastern theatre of the war. Now, the role that the Ottomans had when they joined in with the Central powers was really, really decisive because it threatened the British Empire at its most pivotal point. It is very, very close to the Suez Canal, and it tied down a lot of men. On top of that, it also disrupted the supply lines between the Western allies and Russia, because obviously supplies having to go through the Black Sea and then through the Bosphorus and then past the Dardanelles. Yes, that all goes into Turkish territory, and so by Turkey being on the side of the Central Powers, it meant that this key supply route was hampered. So we're going to obviously dive into some of the details on this. Now, the Gallipoli campaign almost succeeded in our timeline, and the only reason why it didn't is because of inaction and arrogance. Now, the arrogance part of it, that was because Turkey had been declining for many, many centuries, and so and even in like the recent Balkan wars, they've had a complete poor showing of it, and so it was arrogantly kind of believed by the British that all we have to do is land some men there and then march straight onto Constantinople, i.e. Istanbul, and the whole thing will just come collapsing in. Now, it's quite funny that Churchill came up with the same idea pretty much that he ended up having later in World War II, which was this idea of a soft underbelly. He didn't come up with that exact phrase in World War One, but it was the same kind of logic, which was the Germans being the tough force and stuff, and actually if you go up through the Mediterranean and take out their ally there, then the whole thing, it will be a lot easier to unpick. So in World War Two, that the soft underbelly was Italy. In World War One, the thinking was that the soft underbelly was the Ottoman Empire. Now, what was quite funny is that in both cases, this so-called soft underbelly proved to be a tough old gut. And this is why we see that the Ottomans were able to hold off a superior British force, both in men and in materiel. So there was 500,000 Allied troops that landed in the Dardanelles versus just 300,000 Turks, and yet the Turks were able to hold them back. Now, in World War One, the advantage always went to the defending side. This is what you see in the system of trench warfare. Whichever side is able to take the territory and then hold on to it, they're the ones that have the advantage. And so the problem mainly with the Allied offensive was that they landed the troops there and then was like, oh yeah, let's dig in, boys. So they dug like trenches and then lost all the element of surprise, which was the whole point of the campaign, and then just sat there and waited for the Turks to build up their numbers and then to start fighting them. So the whole campaign just kind of floundered on the beaches there, and after many, many months of just complete stalemate, then the British, it was a successful withdrawal, but it was still withdrawal. It's a complete failure, and as a result, it led to the Liberal government in Britain falling in 1916, and Churchill went from being the Lord Admiralty to resigning his position and going to fight on the Western Front. It wasn't really until 1940 he was able to regain any of his reputation, and this is actually why people were so hesitant about making him Prime Minister in 1940, because of his record in campaigns like Gallipoli, where he came up with these great ideas but then didn't actually think about how they would actually be followed through, and didn't like get it sorted properly to make it an actual success. But if it had been a success, what would have actually happened? Now, if the Allies had just gone there and just continued moving, hadn't stopped, hadn't decided that they were going to make a cup of tea and just sit in these trenches, if they'd marched onto Constantinople and taken out the Turks, then they would have freed up many, many men that end up getting bogged down in the Middle Eastern theatre. Now, just give a scale on this. In the Caucasus, Russia had 1 million men that were tied up fighting the Turks. The British Empire had 2.5 million men tied up fighting the Turks. If we think about both the Western Front and the Eastern Front, when we think about what these extra basically 3.5 million men being brought to bear on the Germans and the Austrians, what effect this would have had on the war. Considering how closely fought the war was, and how hard like the Germans were able to fight, and the British had to fight and the French had to fight. Imagine, for instance, on the Western Front, 2.5 million more men. Imagine on the Eastern Front, 1 million more Russians. So we're going to go on Eastern Front first.